They were never meant to last the night. 3 dogs, one gray-muzzled German shepherd, a thin Doberman with tired eyes, and a heavy Rottweiler whose strength was fading, curled together on a wooden porch, stiff with cold. The air cut deep, frost clinging to their coats, ribs rising and falling with shallow breaths. They did not cry out. They did not beg. They waited, not for warmth, not for mercy, but for the man who had once told them he would always come back. When his footsteps finally reached the porch, he carried more than a duffel and worn boots. He carried years of distance, regret, and unspoken promises. This was not a simple homecoming. It was the moment everything fragile would either break or be saved. What unfolded next would reveal how loyalty endures in silence and how grace often arrives through those who have no voice at all. The wind off the water came in sharp and steady, the kind that found every gap in a coat and every crack in tired bones. Port Townsend had always been a pretty town to look at from a distance. Victorian rooftops, salt bright air, the dark line of evergreens holding the horizon. But on a late autumn night, it could feel like the edge of the world. Streetlights threw pale circles onto wet pavement, and the harbor fog drifted in low, curling around parked cars like a slow, cautious animal. Staff Sergeant Ethan Cole drove the last mile with both hands on the wheel, shoulders squared out of habit, eyes scanning even when there was nothing to scan. 3 deployments had trained his body to stay ready when his mind begged for rest. The radio was off. He preferred the quiet. In the quiet, you could hear what mattered. He had not told anyone he was coming home that night, not because he wanted attention, because part of him needed to see what was true when nobody had time to arrange it. He'd pictured it 100 times on nights when sleep wouldn't take, the porch light glowing, the house still smelling faintly of cedar and coffee, the simple relief of stepping into a place that belonged to him. And more than that, the heavy thump of paws and nails on wood, the 3 dogs he'd raised and trained before he left, meeting him at the door like they'd been holding their breath the whole time. The house sat at the end of a short drive, tucked behind a low fence that had once been painted white. The paint was peeling now, but the shape of the place was the same. A narrow porch, 2 steps up, and a single light over the door that cast a warm cone onto the boards. Ethan's truck rolled to a stop at the curb. For a moment he just sat there, breathing, listening. The engine ticked as it cooled. The harbor wind hummed through the bare branches of a maple tree in the yard. Somewhere down the street, a buoy bell sounded, soft and lonely. Then he saw movement under the porch light. At first he thought it was a pile of leaves caught in a gust, but the shapes were too steady, too deliberate. 3 bodies, pressed close together at the top step, hunched into themselves against the cold. Their coats looked dull in the light, not the healthy shine he remembered. Even from the truck, he could see ribs where there shouldn't have been ribs. The dogs weren't sleeping. They were awake, heads lifted, eyes fixed not on the street in general, but on the dark mouth of the road, like they were waiting for something they didn't quite trust to arrive. Ethan's throat tightened. He opened the door and stepped out. The cold hit him full in the face, smelling of salt and wet cedar. His boots struck the pavement with a heaviness he hadn't felt overseas, as if home carried its own weight. He walked toward the porch slowly, not wanting to spook them, even though they were his. "Scout," he said, and the name came out rougher than he meant. "Jet." "Bear." The dogs did not rush him. They did not bark. That was what startled him most. Those dogs had always been loud when it mattered. They had always been alive with energy. Now they were still, as if they'd learned that making noise could bring trouble. The German shepherd, Scout, shifted first. He rose in a careful, guarded way, muscles tense under a coat that was matted at the edges. His ears stood tall, but one tip was nicked the way it had been since puppyhood. In the porch light, his eyes were the same amber Ethan remembered. But the look in them was different, not just recognition, not just hope. There was a question in that stare, a cautious testing of reality, like Scout had been disappointed too many times to believe quickly. Jet, the Doberman, lifted his head next. He was leaner than Ethan had ever seen him, the sleek lines of his body made sharp by hunger. His tail stayed low. He glanced at Ethan and then away, and Ethan realized with a sudden ache that Jet looked ashamed, like the dog thought he'd done something wrong. Bear, the Rottweiler, tried to stand but hesitated. He pushed himself up with a slow grunt, broad chest heaving, breath visible in thin puffs. Even weakened, Bear had that solid presence, the kind that made strangers step back. But tonight he leaned in toward Scout, letting the shepherd take the lead. Ethan stepped up onto the porch. The boards creaked beneath his boots. He crouched, palms open, and kept his voice low. "It's me," he said. "It's okay. I'm here." Scout took a step forward, then another. He lowered his head and sniffed the air, pulling in scent the way dogs do, sifting the world for truth. Ethan held still and let him decide. When Scout finally closed the distance, his nose touched Ethan's fingers, cold, wet, trembling. A shiver ran through the dog's body, and Ethan felt it like a current. Scout leaned in, pressing his forehead against Ethan's chest with a quiet force that stole the breath right out of him. Ethan's hand came up on instinct to the shepherd's neck, to the thick fur that used to feel like warmth and strength. Now it felt too thin, too rough, and that was when Scout shifted his jaw and dropped something into Ethan's palm. It was metal, small and cold, the weight of it unmistakable. Ethan looked down, and the porch light caught the edge of a broken dog tag, one half only, jagged where it had been snapped. The stamped letters were shallow but clear. "Come back." For a second, Ethan couldn't move. His mind tried to make sense of what he was holding, where it could have come from, why it was here. Then the memory landed hard. A dog tag he'd once carried, kept more for the meaning than the rules, tucked into a drawer at home, because part of him didn't want to tempt fate. A tag he could have sworn he'd left behind, whole. His vision blurred. He blinked and felt heat in his eyes that had nothing to do with the cold. Scout's head stayed pressed against him, steady and stubborn, like the dog had been holding onto that piece of metal the way a man holds onto a promise. Jet crept closer, nose brushing Ethan's sleeve. Bear moved in behind them, a heavy shoulder against Ethan's knee. 3 bodies, all of them trembling, not just from the weather. Ethan swallowed, but his throat wouldn't work right. He stared past the dogs at the front door. The porch light glowed. The curtains were drawn. The house was silent, as though it had forgotten how to welcome anyone. He gathered the broken tag in his fist and pulled the dogs closer, the way he might pull a wounded teammate into cover. The salt wind kept blowing. The night kept breathing around them. And in the middle of it, Ethan realized something simple and terrible. Those dogs had not been waiting for food. They had been waiting for him. Ethan stayed on the porch longer than he meant to, crouched with 3 trembling bodies pressed close to him while the wind pushed in from the harbor. The broken dog tag was still clenched in his fist, its edges biting lightly into his palm, grounding him in a way nothing else could. He rubbed Scout's neck with slow, steady strokes, counting breaths the way he had learned to do when the world threatened to tilt sideways. "All right," he murmured at last. "Let's go inside." The words felt strange in his mouth. Inside. He reached for the door handle, half expecting it to be locked, half hoping it would be. It turned easily under his hand, too easily. The door swung open on a soft hinge, and a breath of cold, stale air spilled out to meet them. There was no rush of warmth, no familiar scent of old wood and coffee grounds. The house felt hollow, as if something essential had been taken out of it and not replaced. Scout hesitated at the threshold, ears tilting back. Jet lowered his head and crept forward, nails clicking faintly on the floor. Bear followed last, pausing just inside the doorway as if bracing himself. Ethan stepped in behind them and closed the door, the click of the latch sounding louder than it should have in the quiet. He stood still and let his eyes adjust. The living room was mostly empty. The couch was gone. So was the old armchair near the window. Dust lay in pale streaks where furniture had once stood, like ghosts of their former shapes. The walls looked bare without the framed photos Ethan remembered. Himself in uniform, Claire laughing at the beach, the dogs as younger, fuller versions of themselves. A single lamp stood unplugged in the corner. The floor was cold beneath Ethan's boots. Jet padded toward the kitchen, nose low, moving with the cautious familiarity of someone returning to a place that had changed while he was gone. Ethan followed and stopped short. On the kitchen floor sat 3 bowls. All of them were empty. One had been knocked on its side, a thin ring of dried water marking where it had once held something. Near the base of the counter lay a length of chain, rusted and snapped clean through, its end jagged and sharp. Ethan stared at it, his jaw tightening. This wasn't neglect by accident. This was something else. Scout stood beside him now, body tense. The shepherd's gaze kept flicking toward the back hallway, then back to Ethan as if urging him to look. Ethan moved slowly, each step deliberate, the way he'd learned to clear rooms overseas. The hallway light was off, but moonlight slipped in through a narrow window, just enough to see. The bedroom door stood open. The bed was stripped bare, mattress exposed. The dresser drawers yawned, empty. Claire's things were gone, her clothes, her books, the little glass dish she used to toss her keys into at the end of the day. On the nightstand lay a single item, a folded piece of paper, weighted down by an old coin. Ethan picked it up and unfolded it carefully. The note was short, written in Claire's familiar slanted hand. "Don't look for me. Don't call. It's better this way. Take care of them." There was no signature, no explanation, just that. Ethan read it twice, then a third time, searching for something beneath the words. Claire had never been dramatic. She said what she meant, even when it hurt. But this felt rushed, stripped of emotion, like something written under pressure. Behind him, Bear let out a low, uneasy huff. Jet paced in a tight circle near the door, stopping every few steps to glance back at Ethan. Scout remained still, head high, eyes fixed on the hallway, as if he were guarding something invisible. Ethan folded the note and slipped it into his jacket pocket. His chest felt tight, not with grief exactly, but with a growing sense of wrongness. Claire hadn't left the dogs because she didn't care. She had left them because she couldn't take them with her, or because she hadn't been allowed to. He knelt on the kitchen floor and turned one of the bowls upright. It rattled softly, the sound echoing in the empty space. He pictured Scout, Jet, and Bear sleeping on the porch night after night, pressed together for warmth, listening to the door that never opened. The thought sat heavy in his stomach. "We're not staying here," he said quietly, more to himself than to them. Scout's ears flicked. Jet stopped pacing. Bear shifted his weight, as if relieved by the decision. Ethan moved through the house one last time, checking doors and windows, cataloging what was missing and what had been left behind. There was no sign of a struggle, no broken glass, no overturned furniture. Just absence. And absence, he knew, could be louder than violence if you listened closely enough. Back at the front door, Ethan pulled on his jacket and opened it wide. The cold rushed in again, sharp and bracing. He gestured toward the truck. "Come on," he said. "We're going somewhere warm." Scout stepped out first without hesitation, as though the house had already ceased to be home in his mind. Jet followed, staying close to Ethan's leg. Bear lumbered after them, pausing only once to look back at the dark interior before turning away. Ethan locked the door behind them. the click sounded final. As he helped the dogs into the back of the truck, he glanced once more at the porch. In the glow of the light, the boards still bore the faint marks of where 3 bodies had curled together. Ethan shut the truck door and rested his forehead briefly against the cool metal, breathing in the salt air. Whatever had happened here had driven Claire away and left 3 loyal animals to fend for themselves. And whatever it wasn't finished. Ethan started the engine, the headlights cutting through the fog as the truck pulled away from the house. Behind him, Scout lifted his head and looked forward, eyes steady, as if he already knew that the hardest truths were still waiting to be uncovered. The boathouse sat at the far end of the marina, a squat wooden structure with weathered planks and a tin roof that rattled when the wind picked up. It wasn't much to look at, but it was dry, and the small space heater Ethan had plugged in hummed with a promise the house on the hill no longer kept. He parked close, unloaded a duffel, and ushered the dogs inside, one by one. Scout entered first, as he always did, scanning corners and shadows with a focus that hadn't dulled despite the weeks, months, of whatever he'd endured. Jet slipped in next, paws quiet, body tight. Bear followed with a heavy sigh, lowering himself onto the wooden floor near the heater, as if the effort of standing had finally caught up with him. Ethan set to work without ceremony. He spread old towels on the floor, poured fresh water into a dented metal bowl, and set a small pot on the hot plate he'd brought with him. The smell of warming broth, simple beef, and rice began to cut through the cold air, and with it came a fragile sense of normalcy. "Easy, sir," he murmured as Jet edged toward the pot, nose quivering. "Give it a minute." The dogs watched him closely, eyes following each movement. Scout stood back, weight shifted just enough to block Jet from crowding the counter. Ethan noticed it, a familiar behavior returning on instinct. Leadership didn't need strength to show itself. It lived in habit. When the food was ready, Ethan poured it into 3 bowls and set them down in a loose line. Jet moved first, hunger overriding caution. Bear followed, slower, deliberate. Scout waited. He stood there, head lifted, eyes on Ethan, until the other 2 had begun to eat. Only then did he lower his head to his own bowl. Ethan's chest tightened. He turned away for a moment and busied himself with the towels. After the dogs had eaten and settled, Ethan knelt beside Scout and ran his hands carefully along the shepherd's side. He felt it before he saw it, a hardness under the fur that didn't belong. He parted the coat gently, breath catching as the light fell on a dark bruise, oval and deep, just behind Scout's shoulder. It looked like a footprint. Scout flinched when Ethan's fingers brushed the edge of it, then stilled, jaw set. His amber eyes lifted to Ethan's face, searching, steady. Ethan swallowed and forced his hands to stay gentle. "All right," he said quietly. "I've got you." He moved on to Jet next, easing the Doberman's collar loose. Around Jet's neck ran a faint red mark, a raw line that told its own story without words. Jet tensed, ears flattening, and Ethan felt a flicker of anger rise sharp and fast before he pressed it back down. Bear's injuries were subtler, a nicked ear still healing, a stiffness when he shifted his weight. None of it dramatic on its own. Together, it painted a picture Ethan didn't want to see but couldn't ignore. He finished drying them and sat back on his heels, looking at the 3 of them where they lay on the towels. The heater clicked softly. Outside, the harbor wind rattled the roof. This wasn't neglect born of ignorance. This was cruelty that had learned to keep itself quiet. Ethan stood and washed his hands at the small sink, the water running cold. He stared at his reflection in the cracked mirror above it, at the lines that had settled deeper around his eyes over the years. He thought of the note Claire had left, of the broken dog tag, of the way Scout had looked at him on the porch, as if asking permission to believe again. He turned back to the dogs and sat on the edge of a low bench. Scout rose and came to him, resting his head lightly against Ethan's knee. The contact was brief, restrained, but it carried weight. Trust wasn't something Scout gave freely anymore. "You did your job," Ethan said, voice low. "You all did." Jet shifted closer, curling against Scout's flank. Bear stretched out near the heater, eyes half closed, but his ears stayed tuned to every sound. The pack settled into a shape that felt right, even in a place that was meant to be temporary. Ethan reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the broken dog tag again. He turned it over in his hand, thumb tracing the stamped letters. "Come back." The words felt heavier now, sharpened by what he'd seen. Someone had hurt these dogs. Someone had taught them to be quiet, to wait, to endure. And whoever it was had done it while Ethan was gone, trusting that distance and time would keep him from ever knowing. Ethan slipped the tag back into his pocket and stood. He checked the locks on the boathouse door, made sure the heater was set safely, and dimmed the single overhead light. Before turning it off completely, he paused. Scout met his gaze, unwavering. "We're safe here," Ethan said, "for now." Scout held his eyes for a long moment, then lay down, placing himself between the door and the others. It was an old habit, one Ethan recognized with a mix of pride and sorrow. Ethan stretched out on the bench, boots still on, the day finally pressing down on him. He didn't sleep much. He didn't expect to. But as the night deepened and the wind softened, the sound of 3 steady breaths filled the space, and for the first time since he'd returned, Ethan felt something like resolve take root. Whatever had been done to these dogs was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of the truth. Morning came in pale and quiet, the harbor wrapped in a thin veil of fog that softened edges and muted sound. Ethan woke before the light had fully settled, his body still tuned to early hours. Scout was already awake, sitting near the door, ears rotating at the faintest noise. Jet stirred when Ethan moved, then tucked his head back against Scout's side. Bear remained stretched near the heater, breathing slow and even. Ethan clipped the leashes on and led them outside. The air smelled of kelp and wet wood. Gulls cried somewhere beyond the boats, their calls sharp against the hush. As they walked the narrow path along the marina, Ethan kept his pace easy, watching the dogs more than the view. Jet startled when a pickup rattled past on the road above the docks, flattening himself close to Ethan's leg until the sound faded. Ethan shortened the leash without comment and kept walking. They reached the far end of the pier where old pilings leaned at tired angles, and a small boatyard sat tucked behind a chain-link fence. The sign read, "Sullivan & Sons," its paint chipped by years of salt. A man stood near a half-finished hull, sanding in slow, practiced strokes. He was tall and spare, shoulders stooped, hair white as driftwood. He looked up as Ethan approached. "Morning," the man said. His voice carried the calm of someone who had lived his life outdoors. His eyes went first to Scout, then to Jet, then to Bear. They lingered there, thoughtful. "Morning," Ethan replied. The man wiped his hands on a rag and nodded toward the dogs. "Haven't seen them in a bit. Thought maybe they'd moved on." Ethan stopped. "You know them?" "Hard not to," the man said. "Name's Hank Sullivan. Been working this yard longer than I care to count. Those 3 used to come through here sometimes, back when things were different." Ethan felt something tighten. Different how? Hank hesitated, then set the rag down. "You the owner?" "I am." Hank studied Ethan's face, as if weighing something. Then he nodded once. "Figured. They look like they remember you." Scout stood tall now, posture straight, gaze fixed on Hank. Jet edged closer to Scout's shoulder. Bear shifted his weight, steady and quiet. Hank sighed. There's a man who started showing up at your place a while back. Drives a white SUV, clean clothes, polite smile that never reaches his eyes." Ethan didn't interrupt. "He talked like everything belonged to him," Hank continued. "House, land, people, said the dogs were trouble, called them liabilities." Ethan felt heat rise behind his ribs. "What's his name?" "Trevor Kane," Hank said. "Does real estate up and down the coast. Buys places cheap, sells them dear, that sort." Hank glanced down the dock, then back at Ethan. "I saw him one afternoon behind your house. He had the shepherd on a short chain. Too short. Dog wasn't barking, just standing there, taking it." Scout's ears flicked, but he didn't move. "Then the Doberman slipped close," Hank went on. "Just curious, I think. Kane swung his leg, not even angry, just careless. Scout stepped in front of him, took the hit instead." Ethan's jaw locked. His hand tightened on the leash. "He didn't bite," Hank said quietly. "Didn't snap. Just stood there and growled low. Kane backed off like he'd been warned by something bigger than him." Hank shook his head. "That's when I knew those dogs weren't the problem." Silence settled between them. The fog thinned, revealing the gray line of the water beyond. Ethan looked down at Scout, at the calm set of his shoulders, the unwavering steadiness that had carried him through worse than this. "Did you see Claire?" Ethan asked. Hank's expression shifted. "Once. Late evening. She looked scared. Kept checking over her shoulder. I asked if she was all right. She said she was just tired. 2 days later, she was gone." Ethan nodded. The pieces were fitting together, sharp edges scraping as they aligned. They walked on, leaving the boatyard behind. As they rounded the corner toward the main dock, a white SUV rolled into view and slowed near the fuel pumps. It gleamed against the muted morning, out of place among rusted rails and weathered planks. Ethan stopped. The SUV door opened, and a man stepped out, tall and neatly dressed, hair dark and combed back. He glanced toward Ethan, then toward the dogs. A smile touched his mouth, thin and practiced. "Well," the man said, "look who's back." Scout moved first. He stepped forward, placing himself slightly ahead of Ethan, body angled, tail low but firm. A sound rose from his chest, not loud, not frantic, measured. A warning. The man's eyes narrowed. "Control your dog." "He is controlled," Ethan said. His voice was even. "You must be Trevor." Trevor Kane shrugged. "That's right." Jet pressed closer to Scout. Bear shifted, a solid presence at Ethan's side. Trevor's gaze flicked over them. "You should have taken them with you when you left. Would have saved everyone some trouble." Ethan met his eyes. "You don't get to talk about trouble." Trevor's smile sharpened. "They're just dogs. Property. And property needs to be managed." Scout's growl deepened, just a fraction. Trevor took an unconscious step back. Ethan didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "You stay away from them," Trevor laughed softly. "Or what?" Ethan held his ground. "Or you'll learn the difference between ownership and responsibility." For a long moment the only sound was the lap of water against the dock. Then Trevor lifted his hands in mock surrender. "Relax," he said. "I'm done here." He turned and walked back to his SUV, tires crunching on gravel as he drove away. Ethan exhaled slowly. Scout eased back at his side, the warning gone, but the readiness intact. Hank watched from a distance, then gave Ethan a small nod. "Careful," he said. "Men like that don't like being told no." Ethan looked down at the dogs, at the quiet strength that had endured more than anyone should have asked of them. "Neither do Marines," he said. And as they walked back toward the boathouse, Ethan understood something clearly for the first time since he'd come home. This wasn't just about finding answers. It was about drawing a line. The path behind the boathouse wasn't one Ethan would have noticed on his own. It curved away from the marina, narrow and half hidden by salal and low cedar branches, the ground packed hard by years of rain and neglect. Scout found it just after noon, stopping short and lifting his head as if a switch had flipped inside him. His ears angled forward, nostrils flaring, body drawn tight with purpose. Ethan felt the change immediately. He shortened the leash without thinking. "What is it, boy?" Scout didn't look back. He stepped off the gravel and onto the dirt path, pulling just enough to ask permission without breaking discipline. Jet hesitated, then followed, glancing over his shoulder as if expecting to be called back. Bear lumbered behind them, slower but steady, breath coming deeper as the ground sloped upward. The farther they went, the quieter it became. The marina sounds fell away, replaced by the low hush of wind moving through brush and the distant boom of water against rock. The path ended behind a row of neglected outbuildings, old storage sheds and workshops left to rot when their owners moved on. One of them leaned badly to the left, its door hanging open on a single hinge. Scout stopped in front of it. He didn't growl. He didn't bark. He simply stood there, tail stiff, eyes fixed on the dark interior. Ethan's pulse slowed. This was how Scout had looked overseas when something wasn't right, when instinct spoke louder than command. Ethan stepped past him and pushed the door wider with his boot. The smell hit first. Old metal, damp earth. Something sharp beneath it all that made his jaw tighten. Light filtered in through gaps in the warped boards, enough to see what waited inside. 3 steel stakes had been driven into the packed dirt floor. Rust coated them thickly, flaking under the slightest touch. Short lengths of chain lay tangled at their bases, some snapped clean through, others worn thin, as if tested again and again. Near one stake was a shallow depression in the dirt, smoothed by repeated movement. Ethan crouched and pressed his fingers into the soil. It was hard, almost polished. Jet whimpered softly. Bear's head dipped, shoulders hunching, in a way Ethan recognized too well. Scout stepped forward and placed one paw beside the stake, then another, as if marking it. Ethan didn't need to imagine what that meant. He could see it clearly enough. These dogs had been kept here, not briefly, not as an afterthought, long enough for the ground to remember them. Ethan stood and scanned the space more carefully. In the far corner sat a plastic storage bin, its lid cracked. Inside were empty syringes and a small bottle with a veterinary label, the ink smudged but readable enough to make his stomach turn. A sedative, one used to calm animals, or to make them easier to control. That son of a... Ethan stopped himself, breath held tight in his chest. Scout moved again, nose low, tracking something along the wall. He stopped near a pile of old straw and pawed once, then again, deliberate. Ethan knelt and pulled the straw aside. A small black camera lay half buried beneath it, its casing scratched, one corner cracked as if it had been torn free in a hurry. Ethan picked it up carefully. It was light. Cheap, the kind used for monitoring, not security. Someone had been watching. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment and let the scene settle into place. Trevor Kane. The chains, the sedatives, the camera, Claire's note, the broken dog tag. None of it stood alone anymore. It formed a pattern, ugly and deliberate. Scout's body brushed against his leg, solid and grounding. Ethan rested a hand on the shepherd's neck, feeling the steady strength there, the loyalty that had held even when everything else had failed. "You kept them safe," Ethan said quietly. "As best you could." Scout didn't move. His gaze stayed on the dark corners of the shed, as if making sure there were no more surprises waiting. They left the shed and followed the brush line farther back, the ground sloping down toward the rocky shoreline. That was when Ethan saw it, a scrap of fabric snagged on a thorn bush. He freed it gently. It was part of a scarf. Claire's scarf. He remembered it clearly, the muted blue she wore, on cold mornings. The fabric was torn, one edge frayed, as though it had been pulled away in a struggle or dropped in haste. Ethan's chest tightened. Claire hadn't simply packed up and left. She had been here. She had been scared. And she had left something behind without meaning to. The dog sensed the shift in him. Jet pressed close, his body trembling despite the daylight. Bear let out a low rumble, not a growl, but a sound of unease. Scout stood tall, eyes fixed on the water beyond the rocks. Ethan followed his gaze. The shoreline here was rough, littered with driftwood and old rope. The tide was low, leaving slick stones exposed. Ethan imagined someone standing here, trapped between fear and the cold pull of the water, making a choice no one should have to make. He folded the scarf carefully and tucked it into his jacket. On the walk back, Ethan didn't speak. He didn't need to. The truth was heavy enough without words. By the time the boathouse came back into view, his resolve had hardened into something cold and clear. This wasn't just about what had been done to 3 loyal animals. It was about what had driven a woman to disappear and left a trail of fear in her wake. And whoever had set this in motion had made one mistake. They had underestimated how far Ethan Cole would go and to protect those placed in his care. The storm rolled in faster than the forecast had promised. By late afternoon, the sky over the harbor darkened to a bruised gray, the clouds pressing low as if they meant to sit on the water and not move again. Wind swept across the marina in sudden gusts, rattling halyards and sending a scatter of leaves skidding along the planks. Ethan secured the boathouse door and checked the heater, the habit of preparation settling him even as unease crept in. Scout paced once, then stopped near the door, head lifted. Jet lay close to the bench, body tight, eyes tracking every flicker of light through the warped boards. Bear rose and shifted his weight, planting himself between the heater and the entrance, broad back to the wind. Thunder cracked, sharp and immediate. Jet startled hard, scrambling to his feet. The sound wasn't just noise to him, it was memory. Ethan moved toward him, hand out, voice low. "It's all right," he said. "Easy." Another peal of thunder followed, closer this time, the boathouse shuddering as rain began to hammer the roof. Jet bolted. The door hadn't latched fully. A gust caught it, flung it wide, and Jet slipped through the opening in a blur of black and tan. Scout lunged after him, leash snapping taut in Ethan's hand. Bear barked once, deep and urgent. "Jet!" Ethan shouted, already moving. Rain hit like thrown gravel, cold and stinging. Ethan pulled on his jacket as he ran, boots skidding on wet boards. Scout strained forward, leading, his body low and sure even as the wind shoved at them. The marina lights blurred in the downpour, reflections breaking apart on the slick surface of the docks. They reached the shoreline just as another flash of lightning split the sky. Ethan saw Jet near the waterline, paws scrabbling on wet stone, a length of steel cable wrapped around his hind leg. Each wave that surged in tugged the cable tighter, pulling Jet closer to the dark, churning edge. "Hold on!" Ethan yelled, though he didn't know if Jet could hear him over the storm. Scout surged ahead, barking sharp and commanding. Jet froze for a heartbeat, ears flattening, and that pause was enough. Ethan dropped to his knees in the mud, hands slipping on the slick cable as he fought to get purchase. The steel bit into his palms, pain flaring white-hot as he worked it loose from the root it had snagged around. Another wave crashed in, cold water soaking his sleeves, yanking at Jet's leg. Ethan gritted his teeth and pulled hard, the cable finally giving way with a shriek of metal. He hauled Jet back, both of them tumbling onto the rocks as the water surged past where they'd been seconds before. Jet shook violently, water spraying, then pressed his side against Ethan's chest, whining low. Scout stood over them, body rigid, head down, eyes scanning the darkness as if daring the storm to try again. Bear appeared at the top of the bank, silhouette massive against the lightning, tail high, watchful. Ethan dragged himself upright, legs trembling. His hands burned, blood mixing with rain and mud, but he barely noticed. He wrapped his jacket around Jet and pulled him close, breathing hard, grounding himself in the solid weight of the dog against him. "We're okay," he said, though his voice shook. "We're okay." They moved back toward the boathouse slowly, Scout checking the path, Bear bringing up the rear. Inside, Ethan dried Jet as best he could and checked him for injuries. Aside from raw patches where the cable had rubbed, he was intact. The heater hummed, steam rising faintly from damp coats. Ethan crouched beside Scout and rested his forehead briefly against the shepherd's neck. "You knew," he said. Scout's eyes met his, steady and unblinking. Duty, not instinct. The same language they'd spoken for years. The storm raged on, rain drumming, wind howling. Sometime after midnight, when the worst of it had passed, Ethan stepped outside to secure a loose line he'd heard banging against the dock. The rain had eased to a steady patter, the air sharp and clean. That was when he saw it. Something dark lay tangled in the kelp near the water's edge, washed up by the retreating tide. Ethan moved closer and crouched. It was a phone. The screen was shattered, the casing scuffed, but it was unmistakable. He wiped rain from the glass and pressed the power button. The screen flickered to life. A lock screen photo filled the cracked display. Claire, smiling softly, hair pulled back by the wind, the harbor behind her. Ethan's breath caught. He swiped, fingers trembling, and the phone opened without a code. The battery was nearly dead. Notifications crowded the screen, missed calls, unsent drafts. Ethan opened the last message, time-stamped days earlier, never sent. "Ethan, if you're reading this, you're home. I didn't leave because I wanted to. I was scared. Trevor said if I talked, the dogs would pay for it. I couldn't let that happen. Please don't trust him. Please be careful." The screen dimmed, then went black. Ethan sat back on his heels, rain soaking through his jeans, the weight of the words pressing down on him harder than any storm. Claire hadn't run. She'd been forced into silence. And the dogs, his dogs, had been used as leverage. Behind him, Scout's presence was immediate and solid, a warm weight against his side. Jet and Bear hovered close, quiet now, as if they understood that something had shifted. Ethan closed his eyes and drew a slow breath. The storm had taken its shot and missed. When he stood, his hands were steady. The truth had surfaced, battered but alive. And now that he had it, Ethan knew one thing with absolute clarity. He wasn't done. Morning broke clean and bright, as if the storm had scrubbed the harbor down to its bones. The air held a sharp edge, but the sky was clear, pale blue stretching wide over the water. Ethan stood at the boathouse door with a mug of coffee cooling in his hand, watching Scout sit alert on the threshold. Jet lay curled nearby, eyes open now, without panic, while Bear occupied his usual place near the heater, calm and solid. Ethan hadn't slept much. He hadn't needed to. The words from Claire's unsent message had settled into him with a weight that demanded action, not rest. He made the call just after 8. Officer Maya Reynolds answered on the second ring. Her voice was steady, professional, with a hint of familiarity that came from a small town where faces became known quickly. Ethan told her what he had found, carefully, plainly, without embellishment. The chains, the sedatives, the camera, the phone. There was a pause on the line. "Stay where you are," Maya said. "I'm on my way." She arrived within the hour, rain jacket slung over her arm, notebook already in hand. She listened without interrupting as Ethan walked her through the shed, the shoreline, the boathouse. She examined the broken camera, the empty bottle, the snap chain links. When Ethan handed her Claire's phone, she took it gently, as if it might shatter under anything but care. "This lines up," she said finally. "I've had my eye on Trevor Kane for a while. Threats, coercion, nothing that stuck." Her gaze lifted to Scout, who stood close but calm. "Until now." Maya made a call of her own before she left. "There's a lawyer in town you should talk to," she said. "Daniel Price. He doesn't scare easy." Daniel Price's office sat above a hardware store on Water Street, a narrow staircase leading up to a space that smelled faintly of old paper and coffee. Daniel himself was in his early 40s, lean, sleeves rolled up, eyes sharp but unshowy. He listened the way Maya had, quietly, fully, then asked precise questions that made it clear he'd already begun assembling the shape of the case in his mind. "You're not just talking about animal cruelty," Daniel said at last. "You're talking about intimidation, witness tampering, and possibly worse." Ethan nodded. "I just want them safe." Daniel's mouth tightened. "Then we make sure the truth doesn't stay buried." The truth arrived sooner than Ethan expected. 2 days later, a man named Noah Briggs showed up at the boathouse just before dusk. He was thin, shoulders drawn in as if bracing against a blow that never quite came. He kept glancing back toward the road. "I heard you were looking for answers," Noah said, voice low. "I used to work for Trevor." Scout stepped forward, not threatening, simply present. Noah noticed and swallowed. "I didn't know about the dogs at first," Noah went on. "I swear it. I handled paperwork, accounts. Then I saw things I couldn't unsee." He pulled a worn ledger from his jacket and set it on the table. Pages filled with cramped handwriting, dates and numbers that meant nothing to Ethan, but made Daniel's eyes sharpen when he saw them. "There's more," Noah said. He took out his phone and queued up a video. The footage was grainy, shot from an angle that suggested it had been hidden. It showed a backyard, 3 dogs. Scout in front, Jet pressed close, Bear angled away. Trevor Kane entered the frame, irritation clear in the set of his shoulders. He lifted his foot. Scout's head snapped up. The growl that came from him was low and controlled, the sound of a line being drawn. The video ended. Silence filled the boathouse. Even the heater seemed to pause. "That was the day I quit," Noah said. "He told me if I talked, he'd make sure I regretted it. When your wife disappeared, I knew why." Ethan closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, his voice was steady. "Thank you." Daniel didn't hesitate. "This changes things." The hearing came quickly after that. Too quickly, it felt to Ethan. The courtroom was small, wood-paneled, filled with the quiet murmur of townspeople who had come to see what would happen when money met truth. Trevor Kane sat at the defense table, composed, confident. He glanced at Ethan once, expression unreadable. Scout, Jet, and Bear were not there. Maya had insisted they stay safe. Daniel laid out the evidence methodically. The vet reports, the chains, the sedatives, the camera. Claire's phone, Noah's testimony. Then the video played. The room went utterly still. The judge watched without comment, hands folded. When the screen went dark, she did not speak right away. She looked at Trevor for a long moment, then back at the bench. "I've seen enough," she said. The ruling came down clear and firm. Temporary custody of the dogs was awarded to Ethan pending further investigation. A restraining order was issued. Charges were filed. Ethan didn't smile. Relief for him was quieter than that. That evening he returned to the boathouse as the sun dipped low over the harbor. Scout met him at the door, tail steady, eyes bright. Jet pressed close. Bear huffed softly, content. Ethan knelt and rested his hands on them, one by one. "We're getting there," he said. And for the first time since he'd come home, the words felt solid beneath his feet. The courtroom emptied slowly, the way places do after something final has been said. Chairs scraped softly against the floor. Low voices murmured and faded. Ethan remained where he was for a moment longer, hands resting flat on the wooden table, feeling the quiet settle into his bones. The judge's words still echoed there, not loud, not dramatic, but firm enough to end a long season of uncertainty. Outside, winter had crept closer while they had been inside. A thin frost clung to the courthouse steps, catching the light like scattered glass. Ethan pulled his coat tighter and breathed in the cold air. It smelled clean. Earned. The drive back to the boathouse felt shorter than before. When he opened the door, Scout was already there, sitting upright, eyes bright and focused. Jet bounded forward with a cautious enthusiasm, tail wagging in quick, uncertain arcs. Bear followed more slowly, his heavy steps steady and sure. Ethan knelt and let them crowd him, hands moving from one familiar head to the next. No leashes tonight, no tension pulling at the edges of the room. "It's done," he said quietly. Scout held his gaze, as if weighing the words, then rose and turned toward the door, waiting. Not guarding, inviting. They didn't stay at the boathouse much longer after that. Within the week, Ethan returned to the house on the hill. It was colder inside than he remembered. Dust settled thick on the floors. But the space felt different now. Lighter. Ready. He worked methodically. He hauled out what didn't belong and repaired what did. He fixed the loose boards on the porch and replaced the broken latch on the back gate. He built a covered run along the side yard, not a cage, never that, but a sheltered space with open access to the grass and the sky. Fresh straw went down. Clean bowls were set in the sun. The dogs watched from the porch as he worked, Scout closest, tracking each movement. Jet chased fallen leaves with tentative joy. Bear lay stretched in a patch of weak winter sunlight, eyes half closed. On the evening of the first snowfall, Ethan lit a fire in the old stone hearth. The flames caught quickly, crackling, sending warmth out into the room. Snow drifted past the window in soft, steady patterns, quieting the world beyond the glass. Ethan sat back in a worn armchair, boots off, hands wrapped around a mug that steamed gently. The dogs claimed their places without instruction. Bear nearest the fire. Jet curled beside him. Scout at Ethan's feet, head resting lightly against his boot. For a long while there was no sound but the fire and the slow, even breathing of three dogs at peace. Then Scout stirred. He rose and padded down the short hallway, disappearing into the back room. Ethan watched him go, curious but unalarmed. A moment later, Scout returned with something held carefully in his mouth. He stopped in front of Ethan and lifted his head. The object dropped into Ethan's hand with a soft metallic tap. Ethan stared down at it, heart stalling for a beat. It was the other half of the dog tag, the missing piece. The metal was worn, edges smoothed by time and teeth and patience. He turned it over slowly. Stay. His fingers trembled as he fit the two halves together. Come back. Stay. The words aligned perfectly, as if they had always been meant to meet again. Ethan's vision blurred. He bowed his head and pressed his forehead to Scout's, the shepherd holding steady, accepting the weight of the moment without flinching. "I'm here," Ethan whispered. "I'm not going anywhere." Jet lifted his head at the sound, tail thumping once before he settled again. Bear shifted closer to the fire, content. Outside, the snow continued to fall, softening the hard edges of the yard and the road beyond. Inside, the house felt full for the first time in years, not of noise or things, but of presence. Ethan leaned back and let the warmth reach him. He thought of the porch where it had begun, of three shadows huddled against the cold, waiting, without knowing if the wait would ever end. He thought of promises made too casually once, and promises kept only after everything else had been stripped away. Sometimes, he knew now, the truest test of love wasn't how loudly it was declared, but how quietly it endured. Scout lay down at his feet again, duty fulfilled. The fire crackled, the snow whispered against the windows, and in a house that had learned, at last, how to hold its own, no one was left outside in the dark. If this story moved you, take a moment and leave a comment below. It doesn't have to be long, just a word, a thought, or even the name of someone who would understand this kind of loyalty. If you believe that love shows up not in loud moments, but in the quiet ones where someone stays when it would be easier to walk away, tap the like button so this story can reach others who need to hear it tonight. And if you don't want to miss the next story, stories about courage, faith, loyalty, and the bonds that never break, subscribe to the channel and stay with us. There are many more journeys ahead, and we'd be honored to share them with you.